The desert stretched out endless before him, a sea of dust and stone where the horizon bled into the sky like an old scar. Thomas Briggs sat slouched in the saddle, his hat pulled low against the merciless sun. Every jolt of his horse's stride rattled his bones, worn and aching from years that had not been kind. Dusty, his last companion, carried him with the slow patience of an animal that had seen as many hard miles as its master. The gelding's ribs showed faintly beneath its hide, a mirror of Thomas himself, lean, weathered, and running on little more than stubbornness. It had been years since Thomas had ridden with a posse, or shared a laugh in the saloon, or laid his head beside a woman who called him hers. The world had slipped away piece by piece. Towns rose and fell. Trails shifted. Young men with quick hands and quicker tempers replaced the old names. But Thomas kept riding, not because there was a place he needed to be, but because stopping felt too much like dying. He reached down, absently patting Dusty's neck. "Ain't much further now, boy," he muttered, though he didn't know where further meant. The horse flicked its ears but gave no answer. It was just the two of them, as it had been for years. At night, when the desert cooled and the coyotes sang, Thomas would sit by a small fire, his back against his saddle, and remember Clara. He could still see her smile, soft as spring light, even though she'd been gone near 20 years. Fever had taken her quick. Sometimes, when the night wind swept over him, he swore he could almost hear her voice calling his name, but when he turned, there was only the empty desert staring back. He'd loved her once with the full heart of a younger man, a heart that thought forever was a promise. But forever had proved brittle. He'd buried her beneath a cottonwood by the river, laid a marker of stone, and rode away because staying would have killed him. Since then, he'd carried nothing but ghosts. The days stretched long. Food was scarce, water scarcer still. He'd learned to stretch the coffee grounds until they were pale as dust, and chew jerky so tough it near cracked his teeth. Still, he pressed on. Each dawn he woke stiff and sore, saddled Dusty, and pushed forward into the unforgiving vastness. It was near sundown when he found them. The riverbed below had long since dried to cracked clay, its banks carved deep by floods that never came anymore. Thomas spotted a flicker of movement, a scrap of cloth, the faint shift of a hand. Caution tugged at him first. Out here, a man could ride into more trouble than he bargained for, and he'd lived long enough to know mercy could be a fool's gamble. But he urged Dusty down the slope anyway. Two figures lay crumpled near a boulder, their dark hair tangled with dust, faces drawn tight with hunger. Apache, young women, barely more than girls, though their eyes, when one cracked hers open to look at him, carried the weight of survival. Thomas swung down stiffly, knees protesting. He crouched beside the nearest, a girl with sharp cheekbones and skin sunburnt from days without shade. Her breathing was shallow but steady. The other stirred faintly, a whisper of sound leaving her lips. He set his canteen down between them. "Easy now," he said low, his voice rough from disuse. "Drink slow, too much at once'll kill you." The older one blinked, suspicious, eyes narrowing as if she expected a trick. She reached weakly, her hand trembling, and lifted the canteen. Water spilled down her chin as she gulped, but Thomas didn't pull it away. She passed it to her sister, who clutched it like treasure. They were proud, that much was clear. Even half-starved, their backs tried to straighten, their gazes sharp with defiance. He recognized it. He'd seen that same fire in men cornered and determined not to beg. Thomas leaned back on his heels, scratching at his beard. He didn't have much left himself. Half a sack of beans, a scrap of jerky, and Dusty, his last tie to the life he'd known. He should have kept moving, but Clara's voice, soft and steady in his memory, whispered against his thoughts. She wouldn't have ridden past, he sighed, pulling out a strip of jerky. "Here," he said, breaking it in half. "Ain't much, but it'll put something in your bellies." The younger one snatched it, teeth tearing in before her sister hissed at her in their tongue. She slowed, chewing careful, though hunger burned in her eyes. The elder, still wary, took hers with a curt nod. Thomas poured a little coffee into his tin cup and handed it over too. It was bitter, nearly boiled down to nothing, but they drank as though it were heaven itself. Night settled quick, and Thomas built a small fire. The sisters stayed close together, speaking in hushed words he couldn't follow. He didn't press them, he just sat quiet, watching sparks rise into the black. After a while, the elder looked his way. Her voice was hoarse, accented, but clear enough. "Why?" Thomas met her gaze. "Because you're alive, and out here, that's worth keeping." She studied him long, her eyes narrowing again, but she said no more. When the fire burned low, he unrolled his blanket and lay staring at the stars. Dusty dozed nearby, tail flicking at gnats. The sisters curled together across from him, their breaths soft, exhausted. Thomas felt the weight of the choice pressing in. He didn't have near enough to see them to safety. His horse was worn thin, his rations nearly gone. But when he looked at them, so young, so fierce despite the weakness in their limbs, he knew he couldn't ride off and leave them. By morning, the decision was made. He saddled Dusty, running a hand along the horse's flank. "You've carried me long enough, old friend," he murmured. Dusty's ears twitched, and Thomas felt the ache deep in his chest. The sisters watched, confusion in their eyes, as he led Dusty to them. He pressed the reins into the elder's hand. "He'll carry you better than he can me now. You'll need him more." The younger shook her head sharply, words tumbling from her mouth. The elder caught them, translating with firm defiance. "We do not take charity." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Ain't charity, it's survival. That horse'll get you where your feet won't," they argued, pride bristling. But Thomas only stepped back, his expression carved in stone. He'd made his choice. Finally, the elder laid her hand on Dusty's mane, the fight leaving her shoulders. Their eyes met, hers still guarded, his weary but resolute. Slowly, she nodded. Thomas turned away before they could see the wetness that burned unbidden in his eyes. Dusty was more than a horse. He was the last chapter of a life that had been fading for years. Handing him over felt like giving away a piece of himself. But as the sun rose over the desert, gilding the sisters in light as they steadied themselves with Dusty's help, Thomas knew it was the right sacrifice. For the first time in a long while, the trail ahead didn't feel quite so empty. The desert morning was sharp and cold, the kind of cold that seeped into the bones after a night spent on hard earth. Thomas woke before the sisters, as he always did, years of habit pulling him upright long before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes and stretched the stiffness out of his shoulders, listening to the quiet rasp of Dusty shifting his weight. Except Dusty was no longer his. The horse stood tethered close to the sisters now, as though he had already accepted the change. That thought twisted something in Thomas's chest, but he said nothing. He brewed a thin coffee over the coals left from last night's fire, the smell drifting across the camp. The younger sister stirred first, Ahyoka, eyes blinking against the light. She sat up, her hair tumbling loose over her shoulders, and watched him with open curiosity. When the older one, Nayeli, woke a moment later, her gaze was different, guarded, measuring, the same sharp suspicion that had been there when they first met. Thomas poured a cup of coffee and set it on a rock between them. "Ain't much, but it'll wake you." Neither reached for it at first. Finally, Ahyoka leaned forward and wrapped her fingers around the cup, inhaling the steam. She smiled faintly, a rare softness in her expression. Nayeli said something sharp in their tongue, and the smile faded, replaced by obedience. Ahyoka set the cup back down without drinking. Thomas watched them quietly. He understood well enough what had passed between them, the elder keeping control, the younger yielding. Family always worked that way. Clara used to scold him in much the same tone when he overindulged his nieces and nephews. He almost smiled at the memory. Almost. The sun climbed, burning away the chill, and with it came the decision of direction. Thomas looked out across the flat horizon, scanning the ridges and arroyos. "If you keep north, you'll find water in 2 days. There's a trading post near the buttes." Nayeli rose slowly, still unsteady on her feet, but standing straight, her chin lifted. She spoke with a deliberate weight, her English broken but clear. "You go." Thomas lifted a brow. "You think I gave you my horse just to turn my back? Not a chance. You'll need more in water to make it through." Her eyes flashed. "We are not children." He studied her a moment, the fierce defiance in her face reminding him of a Mustang that had never felt a rope. "Never said you were, but I've seen the trail ahead. Raiders ride it, coyotes too. 2 days on foot would kill you, horse or no." A long silence passed. Finally, she looked away, unwilling to admit he was right, but unwilling to push him off either. Ahyoka's eyes darted between them, caught in the middle. So it was decided without words. They would travel together. The first hours passed in uneasy quiet. Thomas led, walking beside Dusty to spare the animal's strength. The sisters rode double, Ahyoka clinging to her sister's waist, her eyes wide at the endless expanse around them. Now and then, she asked a question, her English hesitant, and Thomas answered as best he could. She wanted to know about the stars, about the coffee, about the gun at his hip. Each answer made her giggle, a sound light and unguarded, though Niley often hushed her with a stern word. When midday heat bore down, they paused in the shade of a rocky outcrop. Thomas shared a handful of beans boiled soft in his tin pot. Niley accepted them without thanks, though she ate with silent determination. Ahyoka smiled shyly as she handed the pot back, whispering a soft "thank you" that sounded foreign on her tongue. As the days stretched, their strange companionship began to take shape. Thomas was not a man of many words, but he found himself watching Nayeli when she thought he wasn't looking. She walked with a pride that the desert could not break, her dark hair falling loose, her eyes sharp and unyielding. He respected it, even when it tested his patience. At night, when they camped, Ahyoka pressed him with questions about his past. Did he have family? Why did he ride alone? What did he dream of? He answered carefully, never giving more than he had to, but some truths slipped through. He told her of Clara, of the farm he once tried to keep, of the river where he buried his heart. Nayeli never asked, but she listened, her face turned to the fire, her eyes catching the light like embers. The first real test came 3 nights in, when riders crested the ridge. A half-dozen men, rough and ragged, eyes sharp as knives, raiders. Thomas had known they'd come eventually. Out here, vultures always circled the weak. The sisters froze as the men rode closer. Thomas's hand rested on his revolver, his body shifting just enough to place himself between the women and the threat. "Well now," one of the raiders called, his grin a broken snarl. "What have we got here? An old-timer with a couple pretty prizes?" Thomas said nothing, his eyes flat, his thumb brushing the hammer of his gun. The raiders dismounted, spreading in a half circle. One reached for Dusty's reins, and Thomas moved quick. The revolver cleared leather, the hammer cocked, and the barrel leveled. "Touch that horse again, and I'll put you in the ground," he said, his voice low and steady. For a moment, silence hung. The raiders laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You ain't young enough to play hero, old man." Thomas didn't flinch. "Don't have to be, just have to be faster than you." The standoff stretched thin as a whipcord. Nayeli's hand tightened on Ahyoka's, her eyes darting from the men to Thomas. She saw the stillness in him, the kind of stillness that came from living too long on the edge of death. At last, the raider spat into the dust. "Not worth it." He jerked his head, and the men backed off, mounting again. They rode away, their laughter echoing, but they didn't look back. When the sound faded, Thomas lowered the gun and slid it back into his holster. He turned to the sisters. "That's why you don't walk this land alone." Ahyoka nodded, wide-eyed. Nayeli's gaze lingered on him longer, unreadable, something shifting in the depths of her eyes. That night the fire burned low, and the air between them felt different. Nayeli sat closer than before, though she said nothing. Thomas felt the weight of her presence, the warmth of her silence. When their eyes met across the flames, something unspoken passed between them, something fragile, dangerous, and alive. The days rolled into each other, each mile carrying them further north, each moment weaving threads between them. Thomas found himself watching, not just to protect, but to learn. He noticed how Nayeli softened when her sister laughed, how she carried burdens without complaint, how her pride was a shield but also a wound. She, in turn, began to see past his years, past the weathered lines of his face. She saw the steadiness in him, the quiet strength that had nothing to do with youth. She saw a man who gave his last horse without expectation, who stood against raiders without fear. And though neither spoke it, the desert trail between them grew shorter each day. By the time the buttes rose on the horizon, their uneasy alliance had become something else entirely, a bond forged in silence, in danger, in the shared fight for survival. It was not yet love, not yet trust, but the shape of both lay waiting, like the first glow of dawn before the sun breaks the sky. The desert night had a way of pulling secrets from a man. When the stars spilled wide across the sky, brighter than any lantern, there was no hiding from truth. The fire burned low, its crackle the only sound besides the distant yip of coyotes. Thomas sat on his blanket, the revolver resting near at hand, though his eyes were not on the shadows. His gaze kept drifting to the young woman seated across the flames. Nayeli was silent, her face turned toward the sky. The glow of the fire lit her cheekbones, caught the glint in her dark eyes. She hadn't spoken much all day, not since the raiders. She carried herself like someone holding back a storm, her pride a wall that let little through. Yet Thomas had seen the way her hand tightened on her sister's, the flicker of fear when steel and violence hung in the air. He knew the look. He'd worn it once himself. Ayoka broke the silence first, as she often did. "You fight good," she said, her English clipped but eager. She hugged her knees, grinning with all the ease her sister lacked. "Like coyote, quick!" Thomas huffed a laugh. "Ain't been called a coyote before. Usually folks say mule." The girl laughed, her voice light against the night. Nayeli's lips pressed tight, as if she meant to scold, but her eyes betrayed a trace of amusement before she looked away. Thomas leaned back on his elbows. "You both handle yourselves well enough. Takes grit to survive out here, with nothing but the clothes on your back." Nayeli turned then, her gaze sharp as flint. "We are not weak." "I never said you were," he answered calmly. "Just said it takes grit, and you've got plenty of it." Her eyes narrowed, searching for mockery but finding none. After a moment, she settled back into silence, though her shoulders loosened slightly. When Ayoka finally drifted to sleep, Thomas banked the fire and stretched out on his blanket. The desert air bit at him, dry and cold, but he'd grown used to discomfort. He shut his eyes, yet sleep was slow to come. Across the fire, he could feel Nayeli's presence like a weight. She hadn't lain down. Instead, she sat with her knees drawn up, her eyes watching the dark. "Can't sleep?" he asked. She startled faintly, then stilled. "The night carries voices," she murmured. "My people say the desert speaks." Thomas opened one eye. "And what's it say tonight?" She hesitated, then said softly, "It says you are not like the others." That pulled him upright. "Others? Men who take what they want, who kill because they can." Her gaze fixed on him, hard and unyielding. "You gave instead, even when you had nothing." For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind shifted, stirring the embers. Thomas cleared his throat, voice rough. "Don't think it makes me a good man, just makes me one who couldn't leave you to die." Her expression softened, though only a little. She studied him like she might a riddle, something not easily solved. Then she said, "Perhaps that is what makes a good man." The words struck deeper than he expected, warming places in him long thought dead. He lay back again, staring up at the vast sky, and for the first time in years, he let the stars lull him into rest. By morning, the bond between them had shifted, invisible yet real. The trail wound through canyons and across endless plains. They shared what little food Thomas had left, gathering cactus fruit and scraping what they could from the land. Ayoka sang at times, low and sweet, while Nayeli scouted ahead, always alert. Thomas found himself falling into a rhythm with them, a strange kind of family stitched together by chance. One evening, after a long day of hard riding, a storm rolled in. Black clouds swallowed the horizon, and the wind howled through the canyons. They found shelter in a shallow cave, its stone walls echoing with the roar of rain. Thomas built a fire at the entrance, the flames fighting against the damp air. Ahioka curled near the warmth, her breathing soon deep and even. Nayeli sat apart, her knees pulled to her chest, her eyes reflecting the firelight. Thomas eased down beside her, careful to leave space, though the cave was small. "Storm will pass by dawn," he said quietly. She didn't answer right away. Her gaze was far away, as though she could see beyond the stone walls. Finally she said, "I dreamed once of leaving the village, to ride across the land without chains of duty, to choose for myself." Thomas listened, saying nothing, letting her words fill the space. "But a woman cannot choose," she continued, her voice bitter. "A father chooses. A tribe chooses. My life is not my own." Her pain was raw, and Thomas felt it keenly. He thought of Clara again, of how she dreamed of children, of planting roots that would outlast them both. He tried, but the land had been cruel, and fate crueler. He reached out without thinking, his hand brushing lightly against hers. She stiffened, startled, but didn't pull away. Her eyes lifted to meet his, and in that moment the storm outside seemed to fade. The silence between them grew heavy, charged with something neither could deny. "You've got more strength than you know," he said, his voice low. "Maybe the world's been set against you, but you've still got the right to dream." Her hand trembled beneath his, but she didn't move. She held his gaze until the fire burned low, and when she finally looked away, there was no anger, only a fragile understanding. The days that followed deepened the unspoken bond. Nayeli no longer kept him at such distance. She asked questions now, about his travels, about the towns he'd seen, about Clara. When he spoke of his wife, her eyes softened, and she listened with a tenderness that undid him. One night, they watched the sunrise together, sitting side by side on a ridge. The horizon blazed gold and crimson, painting the desert in fire. Thomas felt her shoulder brush his, the faintest contact, but enough to set his heart pounding like a young man's. "You look at the world as if it still holds beauty," she whispered. He swallowed hard. "That's because right now, it does." Her eyes widened slightly, then lowered, a faint smile tugging at her lips. It was Ahioka who broke the moment, bounding up with laughter, pointing to the rising sun as though she'd never seen such a sight. Thomas chuckled, shaking his head, but he caught the way Nayeli's fingers lingered near his, so close he could almost believe she meant to reach for him. Yet for every tender moment, there was danger pressing near. Signs of scouts appeared, tracks in the dust, smoke on the horizon. The Apache were searching, and Thomas knew their time together would soon be tested. Still, the bond held. Every step of the trail, every word shared in the quiet of night, drew them closer to something that neither had expected. It was not yet love spoken aloud, but it was a fire kindled deep, one that burned brighter with each passing day. And Thomas Briggs, the old cowboy who had thought his heart long buried in the dust, found himself afraid of only one thing, that when dawn came, the fire might be taken from him forever. The desert air before dawn was sharp as a blade. The stars had not yet faded, and the world held its breath in the gray silence. Thomas Briggs rose first, as he always did, shaking the stiffness from his knees. His back ached, and every bone reminded him of his years. But his hand went steady as he stoked the fire to life. He watched the sparks lift into the cold sky, watched them vanish, and he thought of how fleeting everything was. Behind him, the sisters still slept. Ahioka lay curled near the embers, her face soft in slumber, the innocence of youth wrapped around her like a blanket. Nayeli rested on her side, her dark hair spilling loose, her breathing steady. In sleep she looked less burdened, and Thomas let his eyes linger. He tried not to admit it, not to name the thing that had been burning quietly between them, but out here there was no hiding from the truth. She had become the fire that kept him alive. He pulled his hat low and turned away, ashamed of the ache in his chest. She deserved a man with years ahead of him, not one counting what few he had left. But desire was a stubborn thing, and his heart, foolish though it was, refused to let go. The first hint of dawn touched the horizon, a pale light creeping upward. That was when Thomas heard it, the distant thunder of hooves, at first faint, like a memory, then growing louder, rolling across the desert like a storm. He stiffened, hand going to his revolver. He scanned the ridges, his eyes narrowing. Then he saw them. Riders, dozens at first, then hundreds, spilling over the horizon like a tide of shadows. Spears caught the light, feathers streamed in the wind, and painted faces glowed beneath the rising sun. 500 warriors rode fast and hard, their formation tight, their intent clear as death itself. Thomas's stomach dropped, his jaw clenched. He knew in an instant who they were. The Apache had come. And at their head, tall and proud, rode a man whose presence filled the earth. Their father, the one the sisters had spoken of only in whispers. Chief Taza, his war paint streaked across his face like fire, his eyes burning with fury. "Wake up!" Thomas hissed, shaking the sisters. "Get up now!" Ahyoka blinked, confused, then heard the thunder and sat bolt upright. Nayeli woke with a gasp, her eyes wide as she saw the riders cresting the ridge. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. The warriors fanned out, circling the camp with terrifying precision. Dust rose thick, the sound of hooves shaking the ground beneath them. Thomas stood his ground, revolver drawn, though he knew full well it would mean nothing against such numbers. Still he raised it, his back straight, his eyes steady. Chief Taza reined his horse forward, towering over them, his spear gleaming. His voice boomed across the desert. "You dare take what is mine!" Nayeli leapt to her feet. "Father, no, he did not." "Silence!" Taza roared, his glare cutting her down. His gaze turned to Thomas, hard as stone. "You stole my daughters. You think one old man can stand against my people?" Thomas met his eyes. "I didn't steal 'em. I saved 'em. They'd have died if I rode past." Laughter rippled through the warriors, sharp and cruel. Taza's mouth twisted. "Lies. Always lies. Your kind take and take. You left me no choice but to come with war." He raised his hand, and in that moment 100 bows lifted, arrows gleaming in the dawn. Thomas's throat tightened. He could feel death pressing in, but he didn't waver. His revolver stayed leveled, though he knew it was useless. He spoke anyway, his voice carrying across the silence. "I've got no army, no land, no horse but the one I gave your girls. If you're set on killin' me, do it. But don't call me a thief. I gave what little I had so they could live. That's the truth." The words hung in the air, sharp as steel. The warriors shifted, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. But Tiz's fury was unbending. He spurred his horse closer, his spear poised. That was when Nayeli broke. She ran forward, placing herself between Thomas and her father's weapon. Her voice rang out, strong and desperate. "Do not touch him!" Taza froze, shock flashing across his face. "Move aside, child." "I will not," she cried. "You think he is enemy, but you are blind. He gave us water. He gave us food. He gave us his horse when he had nothing left. Would a thief do that? Would a liar give all he owned for strangers?" Her chest heaved, her eyes burning with tears. She turned, looking at Thomas, then back to her father. "He is no enemy. He is the man who saved my life." And, her voice broke, but she forced it steady, "He is the man I love." The words split the air like lightning. The warriors murmured, stunned, shifting uneasily. Taza's face darkened, torn between rage and disbelief. "You shame yourself," he spat. "You shame me." Nayeli lifted her chin, her shoulders trembling, but her gaze unflinching. "No, father, I honor the truth. You taught us to see honor in a man's heart, not only in his blood. Look at him. Look at what he has done." All eyes turned to Thomas. He stood silent, revolver lowered now, the weight of her words crushing him and lifting him all at once. His heart thundered, but he didn't speak. He let the truth of her stand shine brighter than anything he could say. The silence stretched long. Then, slowly, Taza lowered his spear. His voice came like thunder rolling away. An old man, broken and alone, yet brave enough to stand before 500 with no fear. "And my daughter says she loves you." He studied Thomas with an expression that shifted like the desert sky. Rage, sorrow, then a grudging respect. Finally, he turned to his warriors, raising his hand. "Stand down." The bows lowered. The circle eased, though the tension still burned hot. Taza dismounted, stepping down onto the earth. He walked to Thomas, his eyes never leaving his. When they stood face to face, he spoke low. "You have fire yet, old one. Fire I cannot deny. I will not take your life today. But hear me, this love will not be easy. My daughter walks a path between two worlds, and both will try to break her. If you fail her, there is no place you can hide." Thomas met his gaze steady. "I won't fail her." The two men stood locked in silence, then Taza nodded once and stepped back. The sun broke full over the horizon then, flooding the desert with light. The warriors turned their horses, riding in sweeping arcs, the thunder of hooves fading as they withdrew. Taza mounted last, his eyes lingering on Nayeli. For a heartbeat, sorrow flickered there, but he said nothing. Then he rode after his people, leaving dust in his wake. The silence that followed was heavier than any battle. Nayeli stood trembling, tears streaking her face. Thomas lowered his gun, holstering it with a slow, shaking hand. Ahyoka rushed forward, clutching her sister, weeping openly. Thomas watched them, his heart raw. He had faced death 1,000 times before, but nothing had ever struck him like her words had. She loved him. Against all reason, against all odds, she loved him. When at last she turned to him, her eyes searching his, Thomas felt the weight of years fall away. He stepped forward, his hand brushing her cheek. "You didn't have to say it," he whispered. "Yes," she answered, her voice steady now. "I did." And in the new dawn, with the desert glowing gold around them, Thomas Briggs realized he had found more than survival. He had found the one thing he thought was lost forever. A heart reborn in the fire of love. The desert was quiet after the thunder of 500 hooves faded. Dust still hung in the morning air, drifting like smoke after a battle, but the silence was so deep it pressed against the ears. Thomas stood rooted to the spot, his revolver heavy at his hip, his lungs tight as though he had run 1,000 miles. The sisters clung to each other, Ahyoka still trembling, Nayeli holding her with a strength born of fire. For a long while, none of them spoke. The world had shifted. Death had ridden up to them with a storm of warriors, and somehow it had passed by without claiming its price. Nayeli was the first to break the silence. She pulled away from her sister and turned to Thomas. Her face was wet with tears, but her eyes burned steady, the same fierce eyes that had stood against her father. She took a step closer, then another, until she stood before him. "You are alive," she said, her voice trembling but firm. Thomas gave a dry chuckle, though it caught in his throat. "Reckon I am. Didn't much expect it when I saw your father coming down on us. He wanted to kill you." "He still might," Thomas answered. His gaze softened. "But not today." Nayeli's lips pressed tight, as though she wanted to say more, but her shoulders sagged with exhaustion. Thomas reached out, brushing his hand against her arm. She did not flinch this time. She only closed her eyes for a breath, leaning faintly into his touch, then drew back with a steadiness that surprised him. Ahyoka sniffled and wiped her face with the back of her hand. "He let us go. He could have taken us." But he listened. Thomas looked out over the desert, where the warriors had vanished into the rising sun. "He didn't let you go. He let me go." "Make no mistake, that was mercy bought by your voice, Nayeli. Without you standing there between us, I'd be buzzard pickings by now." Nayeli shook her head. "No, he saw you. He saw your truth." Thomas didn't answer. He wasn't sure he believed it, but he didn't have the heart to argue. The three of them broke camp slowly, hands moving through habit, though their minds lingered on what had passed. Dusty snorted softly as Thomas checked the reins, as though sensing the unease in his master's chest. Thomas patted his neck, whispering, "Still with me, old friend? Reckon we've got one more road ahead." They rode north again, the land stretching endless. The silence between them was different now, filled not with suspicion, but with the weight of what had been spoken aloud. Nayeli had told the world she loved him, not just her father, but 500 armed men. The echo of her words still rang in Thomas's head, and each time it did, his heart stumbled like a colt on shaky legs. That night they camped near a shallow creek, the trickle of water soft against the quiet. Thomas cooked beans in the pot, the smell filling the air. Ahilka ate eagerly, smiling again, as though the terror of the morning had been only a bad dream. But Nayeli sat apart, her gaze turned toward the stars. Thomas carried the pot over and set it near her. "You should eat." "I am not hungry," she said softly. He eased down beside her, his knees popping in protest. "That may be, but hunger don't much care for what we feel. It'll take you whether you want it or not." She looked at him then, the corner of her mouth twitching faintly. "Always practical. Only way I've made it this far." He tilted his head, studying her. "You've been quiet since the riders left. What's in your mind?" Her eyes flickered to him, then away. "I shamed my father." "No," Thomas said gently. "You stood for yourself. That ain't shame. That's courage. He will carry the wound. My people will whisper. They will say, 'I chose a man not of my blood.'" Thomas's jaw worked. "Do you regret it?" Her silence stretched, heavy and long. At last she turned, her gaze steady as the fire between them. "No." The single word landed between them like a stone in water, rippling out, breaking the quiet. Thomas swallowed, the heat in his chest near unbearable. "Then I reckon I can live with that." Their eyes held, and in that moment the walls between them crumbled. Nayeli reached for his hand, her fingers trembling as they brushed his. He closed his rough, scarred hand around hers, and for the first time since Clara's death, Thomas felt something like home. The days that followed were different. The trail was still harsh, the sun still unforgiving, but there was a new lightness in their steps. Ahilka teased openly, laughing when she caught Thomas and Nayeli walking close, their hands brushing. "Old man." She called him once with a giggle, and Nayeli scolded her, though Thomas only chuckled. At night the three of them shared stories. Thomas told of towns long gone, of rivers that once ran strong. Ahilka told tales from their people, filled with spirits and animals that walked like men. And Nayeli, slowly, shared her own dreams, the ones she had never dared speak before. She wanted freedom. She wanted to see the world beyond her tribe's boundaries, to choose her own path. She confessed her fear, too, that she would be torn apart between duty and love, that she would lose herself trying to walk in two worlds. Thomas listened, his hand resting over hers, his voice steady when he said, "You won't walk it alone, not while I've got breath left in me." She looked at him with eyes that glowed like the embers of the fire, and for the first time she let herself believe it. But the desert was not finished testing them. On the fifth night, as the moon rose pale and thin, Thomas heard riders again. Not 500 this time, but enough to make his blood run cold. He shook the sisters awake, motioning for silence. They crouched low in the shadows, watching as a band of raiders passed close, their torches flickering. Thomas's hand rested on his revolver, but he didn't move. They held their breath until the riders passed into the dark. When the silence returned, Ahilka clung to her sister, whispering prayers. Nayeli's hand sought Thomas's arm, her grip firm. He placed his other hand over hers, steadying her. "We're still here," he whispered. By dawn, the danger was gone, but the reminder lingered. The world would not give them peace easily. Still, each trial only bound them closer. One morning, as the sun spilled gold across the desert, Nayeli stood beside Thomas at the ridge. The wind caught her hair, and her eyes were bright with both hope and sorrow. She turned to him and spoke in a voice steady with decision. "My father was right about one thing. This love will not be easy. The world will fight it." Thomas nodded. "The world always fights what it don't understand. But I've spent my whole life fightin'. Ain't about to stop now." Her hand found his. fingers entwining with a surety that left no doubt. Then let us fight together. And there, with the dawn rising over the endless land, Thomas Briggs knew he had found what he thought lost forever. Not just love, but a reason to keep living, a reason to face every mile of hard trail ahead. The desert stretched wide before them, but for the first time it did not feel empty. It felt like a promise, a new dawn waiting to be claimed. Through sacrifice, courage, and a love that defied the boundaries of blood and tradition, Thomas Briggs and Nayeli found hope where the desert offered only silence. What began with an old cowboy's last horse ended with a bond strong enough to stand against 500 warriors and the judgment of 2 worlds. Their story is a reminder that even in the harshest lands, the heart can still find its way home. If you enjoyed this tale, don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Love Chronicles so you won't miss the next story, filled with passion, sacrifice, and unforgettable romance beneath the wide frontier sky.